A biblical perspective on life, culture and current events. This is 2020 on Vision.
Well, let's turn our attention to an issue where there have been significant leaks of detail from the World Professional Association for Transgender Health. It's known as Wpath. In the unveiled guidelines, Christian leaders have identified a lack of ethical and scientific integrity in the push for gender-affirming care, especially for minors and vulnerable young people. These guidelines are currently provided by Perth Children's Hospital under the supervision of the WA Department of Health. So a focus on Western Australia, and good to welcome Maryka Groenwald, who is State Director of the Australian Christians Party in Western Australia. Maryka, welcome back to 2020.
Oh, great to be with you, Neil.
Maryka, what has been leaked about these guidelines?
Well, it's interesting, isn't it? On the back of Tavistock in England, which is a very prominent gender clinic closing, on the back of them banning puberty blockers, it just seems to be coming down like a house of cards. So what the most recent leaks of Wpath have shown is what we've always known, that this is very improvised medicine. It is not safe. It is not reversible. It's not life-saving, ethical. So there's a plethora of concerns now that, of course, Wpath is the leading, or seem to be the leading global authority on this, and their standards of care used in a lot of other jurisdictions, and this has now become very problematic because it's not as great as they say it is.
So, Maryka, the World Professional Association for Transgender Health, and the thought that their guidelines are purely experimental. Any thoughts around the value or the integrity of their guidelines?
Well, this is the problem. I mean, newly leaked files from their internal messages show us that a lot of these panel discussions with professionals, with healthcare providers in the transgender space are actually in many cases operating without parental consent. There is a verbatim quote saying that treatments are quote unquote improvised. So we know now that what is obviously put on a website as standards of care and best practice is absolutely not the case, which is why we're quite worried about gender services and clinics in Western Australia, and Australia for that matter, because a lot of them operate with Wpath's standards of care guidelines.
Maryka, what are the risks to those minors, those younger, vulnerable people? What do you see as the risk to, if they're going along with these sort of guidelines, what's likely to happen?
Well, given that there are issues around informed consent, there are examples in these files of families who have gone through a gender clinic, for example, that were illiterate. So the families couldn't even fully comprehend the treatment plan that they were putting this young child on. In some cases, 10-year-olds were put on puberty blockers, meaning that they had absolutely no concept of the long-term implications, yet they were put on these puberty blockers. The issue of sterility, mastectomies, these procedures and their implications were never fully explained to these children and young people. And beyond that, it is complete medical negligence to expect children to understand, the impact of being sterile. It is just so evil and horrendous. And same with families. They've managed to get a lot of children on puberty blockers, which then puts them on a track to, life-altering procedures. And again, families and children and young people did not have the full knowledge of the implications of these procedures or puberty blockers.
Take us back to thoughts on this Tavistock clinic in the UK, because so many will be aware that it's now closed down and that there are all sorts of legal actions that are happening from parents because their children have gone through such trauma. Give us your insight here, because these are the sorts of guidelines that were guiding the Tavistock clinic. Is that the way you'd see it?
Yeah, absolutely. Now, the worrying thing with Tavistock, and this is on the back of a report released in 2022 by Dr. Hilary Cass, she actually started looking into how young people and families were experiencing these clinics, but actually found that a lot of these gender clinics say the positive mental health implications of going through puberty blockers at an early age, that is a real good thing. That's what these clinics tell people, right? But what Dr. Hillary found is, well, that is actually not the case. Like, the long-term evidence on the outcomes of children and young people who are on puberty blockers don't actually produce a positive mental health outcome. There's actually more mental health issues as a result. Often it's fatigue, depression, various other issues. And of course, that's why there was so much pressure on Tavistock, because they were just looking at the reports, they were looking at unethical methods, and they were going, we cannot keep sending our children to these clinics, knowing that there's a fair bit of ideology behind this medicine as well. So luckily, I think by the end of the month, Tavistock is shutting down.
And the thought that in WA you're pushing for guidelines that are not experimental but actually safeguarding children and vulnerable young people. There's a big difference, and there's a challenge, isn't there, when you've got science versus ideology, and it seems like ideology is winning in Western Australia.
Well, this is the hope. I was doing an interview yesterday, and in response to this interview, the WA government almost verbatim gave me a generic statement that you would find on the websites of places like Wpath. The fact that there's comprehensive mental health assessments done, and there is support and affirming healthcare given to these children and young people. So we're saying, well, great. If there's nothing to hide, then there should be no issues with us launching into this inquiry. There should be no issues with us saying we care deeply about children and young people and we don't want experimental procedures. So the government should have no issue opening up the books, opening up the processes, and actually informing the public how young people and families are taken through these gender clinics.
And of course, those who are in charge of counselling those parents and those children as part of the hospital are doing a disservice. And I guess once you get all sorts of legislation in place that forbids doctors from telling the truth, then you're in real trouble. So you've got to head this off at the pass. What's the likely outcomes of what might be happening in WA right now so far as these sorts of guidelines?
Well, this is what we want to find out. We want to know if any concerns were raised, even by people who work within WA Health or the Children's Hospital. We want to know to what degree Wpath standards of care are actually adopted by the gender services here in WA. We want to know how many minors have been subjected to these procedures. So, we might do this inquiry and find that there are sufficient safeguards in place. But given my conversations with people in the community who are leaving or transitioning or that have gone through these procedures, I'd be very surprised if we do not see similar instances of, improvised treatments and puberty blockers that have been prescribed to children without understanding the mental health implications or properly explaining the long-term implications of these procedures.
Well, Australian Christians Party has a great following in Western Australia. And for listeners to our conversation today, what are you hoping that they will be able to do? Is this something you could drop everything and take some action right now?
Yes. Look, I think we've kicked the hornet's nest with this one, but for us, we're pretty committed to advocate on this issue and have been for some time. But we've got a petition going at the moment that is actually calling for a gender health inquiry. I'm happy to share the link. People can sign it. But it's really to keep this issue in the conversation. I don't want these file leaks to come out and all this information to come out and for people to lose traction on this issue. So we've launched this inquiry as a result to make sure this issue from now till the election and beyond remains in the conversation and remains a priority, and it will be for me as well, and Australian Christians.
So a petition for a gender health inquiry in Western Australia, and no doubt there'll be a link for that on the Australian Christians website. I'll point listeners to australianchristians.org.au. That's australianchristians.org.au. Maryka Groenwald is State Director of the Australian Christians Party in Western Australia. Maryka, thanks so much for sharing these thoughts with us today on 2020.
Thank you so much for having me.
Thanks for taking time to listen to this audio on demand from Vision Christian Media. To find out more about us, go to vision.org.au.